Hey, what's up guys? So you guys already know that Yelan has been released today, and if you're like me and are pulling for her beautiful character design, or because you want a hydro sub DPS on your team, then we're on the same boat. Anyways, I'm not gonna waste your guys' time anymore. If you can drop a like and sub, that would be appreciated, and let's get on to the video. Alright, so we're gonna start off with her skill and attributes, then we're gonna move on to weapons. After that is gonna be artifacts, then constellations, and then finally team comps. So starting off with her skills and attributes, we have her normal and charge attack from her bow. There's honestly nothing special about this, it's just like other characters. But when staying outside of the field for 5 seconds, you're able to shoot a charged arrow that does this. Pretty much has decreased charging time and does AoE hydro damage based on your max HP. I want you guys to remember the multiple times that you're gonna see based on max HP damage. That's gonna be very important when it comes to the weapons and artifacts section. And next up is her skill, and personally I think this skill is just straight up broken, simply because of the fact that it does similar damage to Child's Burst. The damage is based on your max HP. And you have to remember, this is a skill, not a burst that you're using. It has a cooldown of 10 seconds and has two different modes. First is the tap version, where you can only entrap a few enemies depending on how close they are together. But then the other mode you're able to use is the hold version, which pretty much allows you to entangle multiple enemies. But do you guys remember me talking about that arrow that you were able to shoot that does AoE hydro damage? After using the hold version, each enemy that you damage has a 34% chance to reset that. You will know this by the glowing bracelet. And then we have her burst. Pretty much it's the exact same way Xingqiu's burst works. I'm sure everybody here knows how that works. But for the people who don't, casting your burst does a decent amount of damage based on your max HP. And then every time you normal attack, the dice on top of your head is gonna throw 3 arrows at the enemy, which each do a lot of damage. The only problem with Yelan's burst is that it only works with normal attacks. And surprisingly, using Hu Tao with Yelan is actually better than with Xingqiu, because her arrows proc faster than Xingqiu. But that does not go by without mentioning the crazy amount of damage that it can dish out. I've done the calculations and the tests, and Yelan does 3 times more damage in total than a C0 Xingqiu, and 2 times more than a C6 Xingqiu. The duration is 15 seconds with a cooldown of 18 seconds, which pretty much means almost 100% burst uptime. And the energy cost is 70, which isn't the high end, but it's still manageable. And yet again, both the casting and the arrow damage are based on your max HP. Quickly going over the 3 passives. The first one is you will get 25% more rewards when dispatched on Liyue expeditions. This one's pretty niche. And the second one is called turn control, which means the more elemental types you have on your team, the more max HP you will have on Yelan. For example, if you have a full team of Hydro, Yelan is only gonna have 6% more max HP. But if you have a team of different elements like Yelan, Toma, Zhongli, and Raiden Shogun, you will have 30% more max HP, which obviously increases your damage. And finally, when your burst is active, the character that's on the field is gonna do increased damage. Every second that you stay on the field with that said character, they're gonna do even more damage every second. So usually what I like to tell people is to do all your other character rotations first, then do Yelan's burst, then go into your main DPS, so that you can get maximal potential. So this is where most players just turn into a dumbass and don't know what to use. But don't worry, I will be here for you. So usually in my videos, I do tier lists for the best weapons. But this time, I'm just gonna go in order. The weapon section is gonna be split up into 2 parts though. One is gonna be if you have the emblem set, and one is gonna be without the emblem set. We'll get more into that in the artifact section. You have to watch the weapon section and the artifact section together. So let's start off. The non-emblem weapons is the Aqua Simulacra. Not only is your HP increased by 16%, but anyone near you takes 20% more damage. And on top of that, you get a bunch of crit damage. This is without a doubt the best weapon for Yelan. But the next one is going to be coming in hot, and a lot of you guys may not expect this one. It's going to be the Stringless. Okay, so before I get attacked for putting the Stringless on the number 2 spot, I need you guys to understand 2 things. Number 1, the base attack of the weapon is completely useless. And I'm talking about that for every single weapon that I'm about to mention. Because as we said, all of Yelan's attacks are based off of max HP. So the good thing about this weapon is not only the elemental mastery, but its passive, which is increased elemental skill and burst damage by 24% at R0 and by 48% at R5. Obviously, most people have this weapon at least R3, and a lot of people like me have it at R5. And the second thing I need to explain is how damage is calculated with this weapon. Let's just say you have a Stringless at R5. and you have a hydro damage cup. That multiplicative damage that you're gonna have is gonna be added by 48%. So for any people who are monkey brain, let me explain this as simple as possible. If you do 1000 damage, the hydro cup is gonna make it 1400 damage. But if you add the stringless to it, instead of 1000 damage, you're gonna have 1900 damage. Obviously the damage only applies to your burst and your skill, but that's the two main damage dealers on Yelan's kit. And this scales even more with crit, HP scaling, and skill scaling. But going back to the elemental mastery, other than the fact that your electrocharge and vaporized damage will be increased, if you apply pyro to the enemy and then use your skill, you will do a shit ton of damage. Here's a demonstration. But if your stringless is at C0, then the next two weapons are actually better than the stringless. And the number 3 spot is the polar star. The passive, all of this shit, do not read it. The only thing that actually works on Yelan is this. At C0 for the polar star, you get an increase in your skill and burst damage by 12%. It's the exact same thing that the stringless does, but less. The only reason why it's better than the C0 stringless is because of the fact that its substat is crit rate, which means much more consistent damage. And on the number 4 spot is a very simple weapon. It's the Skyward Harp. You get an increase in crit rate by about 22%, and increase in crit damage for 20%. And here and there you'll do a little bit physical damage based on your attack, but obviously that's not gonna matter. So the only thing that matters is the crit rate and damage, which is obviously good. And lastly, another funny spot for this weapon to be in, the recurve bow. This is a 3-star bow, everybody has it, so that's why this is on the final spot, 5th spot, and yes, it is actually probably the 5th strongest weapon as well. I was debating whether I should put this weapon or the Thundering Pulse, but I decided to do this weapon for 2 reasons. Number 1, you do not have to depend on a crit to do extra damage, and number 2, it's a very easy weapon to get. So you could just slap this on Yelan at any time you want and throw the Thundering Pulse on something important, such as Yoimiya or Child. Anyways, back to the weapon itself. It is the only bow in the entire game that gives HP percent as a substat, and 46% to be exact, which is actually really nice for Yelan. And just as a bonus, you restore 8% HP when killing an enemy. This can only be procced when you're on the field, but anyways, onto the weapons that you can use with the emblem set. And to start off at the number 1 spot is going to be the Elegy. It not only gives a lot of energy recharge, but also a decent amount of elemental mastery of 60. And on top of that, whenever your burst and your skills hit enemy, which by the way Yelan is very good at doing, your team gains 100 elemental mastery and 20% attack. Just in case any of you guys were wondering, yes, the buffs also do apply to Yelan. You're not going to get anything from the 20% attack boost, but you will get some stuff from the elemental mastery boost. And that buff that you give to the team has a 60% uptime, which is amazing, especially if you're going to have a main DPS on the team. And then on the number 2 spot is just going to be both of these weapons, the Favonius Warbow and the Sacrificial Bow. Both give energy recharge, which obviously, just like the Elegy, is going to help increase burst damage if you have the emblem set. The Favonius Warbow is going to give you more particles if you crit, and the Sacrificial Bow allows you to use your skill once more. So honestly, it just depends on whichever one you want to use. We only have 4 artifact sets that I'm going to feature because these are the only 4 that you can actually use. But let's start off with the 4-piece emblem. Obviously, this is good not only because you get energy recharge, but because Yelan's burst is going to do more damage. And if you want to use any of those energy recharge weapons that I recommended earlier, that would be good. But remember, if you want to use the emblem set with the stringless, there's no harm in that. I just think that if you're going to go for the emblem set anyways, you might as well use the energy recharge weapon. Next up is the set that I'm using. It's the 2-piece Tenacity and the 2-piece HOD. This one is really good because you get an increase in hydro damage and you get an increase of 20% HP, which is what Yelan uses to scale damage. And the third one I recommend is the 4-piece Noblesse. You not only get burst damage for yourself, but also 20% attack to your teammates after using the burst, which is really nice considering the fact that Yelan is going to be off of the field most of the time. But just know, you can use the 2 pieces of the sets that I just mentioned together. So if you want to use a 2-piece emblem with a 2-piece Noblesse, there's no issue with that. So let's go over the main stats and the substats very quickly. It doesn't need too much explanation. If you're going to use a 4-piece emblem set, you want to go for energy recharge. If you're going for anything else other than the 4-piece emblem, you can go for HP percent, or if you need that extra bit of energy, you can stick with energy recharge. For the cup, without a doubt, no competition, hydro damage wins. And then as for the circlet, you want to have a 1:2 to 1:3 ratio. So if you're using a weapon that has crit rate or crit damage, then go for 60 to 80% crit rate and 160 to 200% crit damage. But if you're going for the stringless like me, or any other weapon that doesn't give you crit, then you can have 50 to 60% crit rate and 150 to 180% crit damage. damage. For substats, your top priorities in order are crit rate and damage, HP percent, energy recharge, and elemental mastery. As for the mediocre substat, there's only one, and that's flat HP. It doesn't give as much as HP percent, but it still gives you a damage boost for your Yelan. And as for the 4 useless substats that you do not want to get whatsoever is attack percent, flat attack, defense percent, and flat defense. So her C1 gives 1 additional charge to your skill. It's the exact same thing as Sucros's Constellation 1, where if you want to use the sacrificial bow, you can spam the skill 3 times and be very close to your burst, or get it depending on your energy recharge. Or if you're off the field for a decent amount of time and come back, you're able to use it twice. So this one isn't a huge power spike, but it's definitely good. Next is the C2, which is actually really nice. As long as you're consistently attacking, every 1.8 seconds, there's gonna be an extra arrow that shoots 14% of Yelan's max HP, which by the way is a lot. This is a pretty good power spike. C3 increases your burst level by 3, and C4 is interesting. So pretty much after activating the skill and damaging the enemies, depending on how much enemies you damaged, you can gain up to 40% max HP for all your characters on the team. You get 10% for each enemy you damage, and it lasts for 25 seconds, which is a very long time. This is a huge power spike for Yelan, as it increases her skill and burst damage, and is also really nice if you have something like Zhongli on the team, which also benefits off of max HP, and possibly any other characters in the future coming out that might be based off of max HP as well. C5 increases your skill level by 3, and C6 is absolutely crazy when it comes to DPS. I'm gonna try to explain this as simple as possible. So pretty much after using your burst, in the span of 20 seconds you can shoot 5 arrows which all do breakthrough barbs. Keep in mind you do not have to charge attack for these. You can do simple normal attacks, and all 5 arrows will do 156% of damage that it usually does, which pretty much means 1.5 times the amount of damage. So let's just say that with one breakthrough barb arrow you're able to do 1000 damage. Instead of doing 1000 damage, you're going to be doing 1500 damage, and then times that by 5 because you're going to be shooting 5 of those arrows. That's going to be a lot of damage, and I've tried it out. It's pretty fun. Before we get into the team comps, I'm going to be talking about Constellation Plans and weapon versus Constellation. So in terms of Constellation Plans, this is for the whales and dolphins. You either keep her at C0, she's a very solid unit at C0, push her to C3, which increases her burst damage by a lot and gives her 1 charge of her E skill, or just push her to C6 and do 1,000,000 damage with her. And lastly is weapon versus Constellation 2. So as we already know, pulling for 1 signature weapon of a character is the average cost of pulling for 2 constellations. So I'm gonna get the question, should I pull for the Aqua Simulacra or C2? And my answer for that is definitely C2. There's 2 reasons. Number 1 is that getting her other weapons that are really good for her, such as the Stringless, is very cheap. She's actually a very cheap character, which doesn't require too much investment to do a lot of damage. And number 2, the weapon Aqua Simulacra itself is not a universal weapon. Yes, it does have crit damage and does more damage to enemies nearby, but that doesn't change the fact that you get 16% HP with a low base attack. You would rather pull for something like the Polar Star or the Thundering Pulse, which can be used on most bow characters. So yet again, I'll say this, if you're planning to pull for C2 or the weapon, definitely go for C2. Alright, so when it comes to team comps, trading something like Yelan is actually difficult. Unlike Zhongli, Albedo, or Xiangling that can fit in any other team, Yelan requires characters built around her. She has a very conditional burst that only works with normal attacks and not with damaging attacks like Raiden Shogun's E, nor with charge attacks. And another problem is that she has no benefit from attack boost, which means using something like Bennett won't prove as useful for the team. Also, another problem is her passive, which prefer multiple different elements on the team so she can do more damage. So I'll give you an idea of what to be running and what easily works with Yelan, and then my 2 favorite teams in terms of power and fun. So as we said, Yelan doesn't benefit from Bennett, so if you need someone that can tank damage, just use Zhongli. He's a universal character, reduces physical and elemental resistance, and obviously has his shield. He's also good because paired with Yelan, they both have max HP scaling, which means they don't need an attack booster on the team. A consistent pyro sub DPS is also decent, something like Xiangling or even Toma, because him and Yelan are pretty similar when it comes to their abilities. He's also able to be the shielder of the team if you want to do that. And you can definitely run Raiden as a main DPS or something like Fischl, Beidou, Yaimiko as a sub DPS just for some electro reactions. And it will never hurt to add an animal support. Something like Kazuha or even Sucros can increase the elemental mastery and elemental damage of the team, especially considering the fact that you will have a variety of elements with Yelan. They can all just pair together and do a bunch of reactions. And I might as well give the characters that you should completely avoid. destroyed, these being Ayaka, Ganyu, Ito, Keqing, and Xiao. It's ironic considering that 4 of these characters are actually the strongest DPSs in the game right now, but they all depend on something like a charge attack or a plunge attack. Another thing to consider is not to use Yelan with freeze teams. The reason is because Xingqiu is simply better at doing her job for that. Not only can he charge attack to also apply Hydro, but whenever Xingqiu's rain swords are active, which is pretty much 24/7, any nearby opponents will be affected by Hydro, which is something this little cube cannot do. But now let's talk about the best main DPS units to actually use with the Yelan. So other than Raiden Shogun, which has already been mentioned, you can use Diluc, Klee, Yanfei, and Yoimiya. All 4 of these characters synergize with Yelan pretty well, and especially Yoimiya. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now you guys probably noticed I haven't included Child or Ayato, and yet again this is due to her passive, but that doesn't mean that you cannot use those 2. In fact, one of my favorite teams is the Flood comp, where I use Child, Xingqiu, Yelan, and Kazuha to do 1,000,000 Hydro damage. If you don't have any of the Pyro characters built, or if you're using Raiden Shogun on the other half of the Spiral Abyss, it won't harm as much to use Child or Ayato as the main DPS. Now in terms of specific team comps, other than the Flood comp, my favorite team to use was Yoimiya as the main DPS, Yelan as a sub DPS and Hydro applicator, Fischl for the electro reactions and a ton of damage, and Kazuha to swirl all 3 of the elements, and obviously give damage boosts. The 2 things with this team that's really nice is that Yoimiya is a pure normal attacker. She doesn't do any form of charge attacks or plunge attacks, which means her and Yelan work really well together. Every time you hit a Vaporize, it's satisfying, it does a lot of damage, and on top of that, Fischl is just doing a lot of electro damage on the side, which adds more to reactions. But my favorite part about this team is the fact that no matter how much the enemies bounce from the overload reaction, you can still hit them, and this is because Yelan's burst is auto-targeting, and it's the exact same thing with Yoimiya's auto attacks. And the next team was what I personally thought to be the strongest, was a variation of the Chinese national team. So pretty much instead of Raiden Shogun, Xingqiu, Xiangling, and Bennett, I replaced Xingqiu with this gender bend mommy form and removed Bennett for 2 reasons. Number 1, I prefer to have 4 elements on the team, and number 2, Yelan doesn't care about attack buffs, so I added Kazuha instead. And honestly, I would say that this team was a little bit stronger than the Yoimiya team, but the Yoimiya team was more fun. Is Yelan an amazing character? Is she a must pull? Simple answer is actually no, unfortunately. So if you're going for the aesthetics, you're doing it for fun or whatever, go ahead. There are much better characters to pull for. You already have Xingqiu, which is exactly what Yelan does. Even though he does do less damage, he is still very much usable for Hydra application and still some decent amount of damage. She doesn't work with a lot of characters, and overall I see her more as a sub DPS than a support. She doesn't fit as a main DPS unless you have C6, and for support capabilities you only have her Hydra application. And then you can compare that to something like Ayato, which can be a main DPS and a sub DPS and support if you want him to. Same thing with Ganyu. So unless you already have her, I would save your gems for something like Kazuha, and if you want her for the aesthetics, then hey man, go ahead. She's still a good character. Anyways, that's the end of the video. Go ahead and cop my merch in the description. Nah, I'm just joking. I don't have any of that shit. But if you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate a like yet again, and if you could subscribe, that would be good. And see you guys in the next video. Peace.